The Center for Educational Media and the College of Education at Middle Tennessee State University are proud to offer professional development to K-12 educators in Tennessee through our online video library. These videos are aligned with standards set by the Tennessee Department of Education. For more professional development videos, check out our website at www.mtsu.edu/CEM. Welcome to the Center for Educational Media. This is the SPED Collaborative coming from the College of Education at Middle Tennessee State University. So we're about to have a really great session here with a panel from the Tennessee Department of Education. When we invited Susan Ussery to join us today, she suggested that she bring a group of her colleagues to bring a panel and to answer questions that have been submitted by teachers across the state of Tennessee regarding special education and the Tennessee Department of Education. So this panel presentation today will be framed in terms of the questions that were submitted by teachers to this panel of educators from the department. So Ms. Susan Ussery and Ms. Allison Gauld, Ms. April Ebinger, Dr. April Ebinger, and Ms. Joanne Runyon are here today with us. They will give further introduction, giving more background about their role and their experience. So thank you for being here today, and I look forward to hearing the conversation and the questions.
Thank you, Dr. Clark. So I'm Susan Ussery. I am the Senior Director of Special Education Programs at the department, and here with some amazing colleagues, and we're happy to be here to try to address any questions that you have related to special education. I'm going to pass it to Allison.
So I'm Allison Gauld. I am the Low Incidence and Autism Coordinator. I'm also the lead of our professional development.
Hi, good morning. I'm April Ebinger. I'm the Director of Psychological and Behavioral Services for the department.
And good morning, everyone. I'm Joanne Runyon. I am Director for Intervention Programs. And so even though we're going to be talking about special education today, the role that my team and I play on this wonderful team is to serve students who need interventions, students who are English learners and are receiving instructional programming, intervention in that realm. So the areas that are addressed as student needs prior, I guess, to the services being received under IDEA.
And Dr. Clark and her team sent out some questions to the field in advance of this presentation. So we have some of those here, but we also want this to be a useful presentation for everybody here and online. So we're welcoming questions from the field, from folks that are joining us remotely, as well as you all here in the audience. So I'm going to just get us started and show you the main buckets of work or categories that most of the questions fell into. So these first are our three strategic priorities of the department, that academics, that all students have access to high quality instruction, and then student readiness, that we're equipping all students academically and non-academically for successful post-school outcomes, and that we want Tennessee to be a model state for educators. But we've done our introductions, and here are the main categories in which you all submitted questions. So the first one being progress monitoring and goal writing. So do we want to tackle some of the ones, team, that came in about progress monitoring first?
Sure. I think we'll start with the logistics of the requirements, and then we'll talk about how you actually implement that.
Do we want to repeat the question for them?
Sure. So one of the first questions that we received was, I would like to know how we are properly monitoring progress for high school using elementary, middle school probes instead of using grade level standards and classroom work.
Tricky question, right? I think we need to start using both. I know often we are using our progress monitoring tools, especially around those reevaluations, those triennial reevaluations, to determine if a child is still eligible under specific learning disability. You certainly can do that as a team, but we shouldn't not use or utilize the grade level assignments, assessments that are being given to that student in high school as we're making those determinations. I think we need to use both pieces of data and not just lean into our K-8 progress monitoring as we're making determinations for students. I think they're both valuable, but their value is being used in different manners. So in that case, we absolutely can use grade level classroom-based assessment, assignments, rubrics to determine if a student is responding to that intervention, responding to that instruction. And that may be more of an anecdotal narrative that you're providing in your progress monitoring report or your evaluation report, but both pieces of data are just as useful, and we have to ensure that the data that we're collecting and we're analyzing is meaningful for that student, and it's actually valid and reliable. So if we are using potentially an 8th grade probe for a high schooler, what does that mean for that student? Does that mean that they can't achieve grade level standards because they're still reading on potentially a middle school level? Not necessarily. And so really understanding and doing some item analyses as well with those probes is going to be in your best interest. But I think, again, the work and the assignments that they're able to do or not able to do in the classroom give you a really good understanding of where you need to go with your IEP goals, or potentially if you need to collect additional data through that reevaluation process. Allison, feel free. Please jump in here for me.
Sure. And then I think it becomes logistically, how do we monitor those IEP goals, right? So we've used both this classroom performance data as well as some of those probes to identify the skills for our goals. But then how do we manage that? Caseloads continue to grow and get larger. And I think there's a couple things that we forget. One is it is not just a special educator's job to progress monitor. So all of the individuals that are engaging with the student can play a role in a way that's authentic, right? So think about that student who perhaps is attending general education for English, right? Especially in high school, they need that credit. They're going to be attending. That English language arts teacher is able to take some progress monitoring data for you as well as the special educator perhaps during intervention. And then you have a way to say, does it matter what setting they're in? Does it matter whether the context of the skill is isolated or embedded authentically, right? So it is not all just you. I think the other thing is we get very stuck on like, this is my progress monitoring day, right? I will go into schools on a Friday and they're like, well, today is our progress monitoring day. You can spread this out so that you are progress monitoring 1 or 2 goals per class and then rotate your kids so that over the course of 2 weeks, all students have progress monitoring, but you're not doing all on that one day. That also allows for students to be absent where you don't end up losing their data continuously because they have a tendency to get the flu Thursday night, right? Not that any students would do that. So having a rotation, really building a schedule, you can see an example of that on our website, which is not always the easiest to navigate, I know, but on the low incidence webpage, there's actually a schedule created for how do we progress monitor a little bit at a time across the courses so that you can spread that out, and you can spread it out across all the adults, not just the special educators. So I think it's really about systematically planning when that happens and balancing that with the importance of instruction so that progress monitoring isn't the only intervention occurring for students.
One thing I would add about that is when you're developing your IEP goals is to really use all of the data that's available to you. I think oftentimes we rely on the school psychologist evaluation to drive everything, but there are so many sources of data that need to be used when you're developing goals for your students so that they are meaningful. So we're making sure that they actually have access to that Tier 1 instruction rather than looking at isolated skills that may have been identified during a standardized assessment. So remember that we've got to make the connection to the classroom. The student is a student to be educated along all of their other peers, so that needs to be the primary objective, is to make sure that they have that access, that we're not working on something in isolation that is not connected to the curriculum. Those were the primary questions we received in this area, but we want to take a moment and ask you all here or folks online if you have any specific questions related to progress monitoring or goal writing. All right, nothing online? All right, let's see. So here was one of the other areas that there were a lot of questions about was least restrictive environment. And I think just one, we need to understand what least restrictive environment is, and Allison does a ton of work on that and just trying to help folks understand that it is not just a place. I think folks often think of least restrictive environment as just the general education classroom, and that is not, in fact, what it means. And I don't remember if we got specific questions that you wanted to tackle, but this
I
isn't.
don't know that we had specific questions, no, but it is a common question on LRE being general ed. And LRE is not. If the federal government meant that LRE was general ed, they would call it general ed. They're not that creative, right? When they named it something else, that was with great purpose and intent, that we were looking specifically at the student and deciding class by class, minute by minute, where is their least restrictive environment, meaning they have the greatest potential access to general education and general education peers while still benefiting from that program. Notice I say not maximizing their benefit, right? I think we could all develop a plan where a child absolutely maximizes how much they grow, but there's a lot of cost to that. And so this is really balancing the need to be engaged in general education to the greatest extent possible while still benefiting. Notice I also said minute by minute, class by class. If a student needs self-contained for English language arts, that does not mean they're in the self-contained setting for the day. It means you've decided where English language arts is occurring. You also need to even consider like arrival. What does that look like? Lunchtime, what does that look like? What does it look like in high school or middle school where they're exchanging classes? All of that should be considered within your least restrictive environment, which notice is not necessarily services. They're different. So least restrictive environment is how do we ensure the greatest access to general education while also ensuring progress. And it is hard. It is tricky. There are times in our career with students where we're kind of guessing because we don't have enough data. We've never tried it, right? Think about that student that goes from elementary school where they're with the same teacher all the time. And now they're going to go to middle school and they're going to exchange classes. We're guessing what that transition will look like. And so that's where we really need to lean into the least dangerous assumption that we assume they can do it. Think about it. If a student comes into kindergarten, I love kindergarten, it's a lottery. You have no idea what you're getting in that kindergarten room until they show up because they just enroll. But when those students come, some of them have better skills at being able to sit on their bottom and listen for 15, 20 minutes without losing attention, and some don't, whether they have a disability or not. But both are benefiting. So us looking and saying we know they have an IEP and over-planning is not the least dangerous assumption. We need to assume they can be successful. We need to assume that we can create the accommodations and supports to achieve that, and only when that does not happen should we consider other placements. And that's really what the LRE is it's a decision-making plan around balancing the needs of general education as well as the needs for the students to progress. Did I miss something?
I don't think so. I just want to add, so I have gotten a lot of questions recently around students who are identified under specific learning disabilities, especially once they get to high school setting, and so I want you to jump in here. I think there was maybe some miscommunication, misunderstanding, whether it was in our previous RTI manual or just some assumptions districts had made that all students with SLD had to be in an intervention block.
Right.
Can you speak? Yeah, can you speak to that, please?
Thanks for pointing that out. So there is an intervention course code available in high school for one specific purpose, and that is that should a student require as their LRE intensive intervention, we don't want them to be at risk at not accumulating credits. Notice I said, should a student require. I did not say IEP students require, right? Or students with an IEP require. And we'll see those words in policies. So if you see that policy, feel free to have an email come to us so that we can clarify. But it is really and truly there as a option in order to ensure that high schools can provide a full continuum of alternate services and supports available to students. So only if a student requires intervention should we consider that, and we provided that intervention course code in class so that they can continue to earn credit, and that is a 1-credit class. It can count as an elective, or it can count in that focus area so that our students are not at risk because they need intervention, but it is not a requirement for a student with an IEP to participate in that course if that is not appropriate. Yeah.
So to piggyback on that, I think that there's some questions that we have heard as well about, well, when we're doing the monitoring for the IEPs, you know, that every PLEP that's exceptional has a goal, that has a service, that has et cetera. And so trying to discern whether service means a direct pullout versus a consultation or an accommodation or those types of other things. Can you speak a little bit more to that to help clarify for those who may have questions about how to tie those in and to make sure that we are matching up with what the state expectation is for the monitoring piece, but we're also definitely honoring LRE as it's intended?
For sure. I'm happy to address that. I think that's a great and common question. So yes, if you've identified a deficit for a student, you need to make sure you've done something to overcome it, right? So if you've said this is a concern, do something about it. But what something is again decided by the IEP team. So in some cases, it is consultation. You might have someone that's consulting, meaning working with the other adults, pretend these are all the educators that work with a student, on strategies they're going to embed in the classroom and supports they're going to provide regularly that helps the student overcome or compensate for that deficit. We especially see that in high school because they're getting ready to be grown-ups, right? It's about time for them to move on and be independent. We need to figure out how to set them up for that success. It might be that that service is occurring in general education where another individual is coming into the classroom and providing services, maybe even where we don't see it directly with the student, but that there's small group or station learning or one of the other co-teaching models in place. It might be that it's pull-out, but a pull-out does not have to be bell to bell. So it might be, for example, English language arts, the students are all reading a novel or reading a story, and the student has had access to that through auditory book. They know the story, they engage in the conversation, but then when it comes time for some independent writing, they go to another setting where they get some very intensive intervention in the skill of writing, all within that same block. It's really decided for the kid. And so we need to be careful that when we think of goal and service, that we recognize that that service is the full continuum. And we just want to see you're doing something to address the deficit you identified. What that something is decided by the team.
I would also say, too, that, that you may have a student who has an IEP, but that doesn't mean that every course requires a goal or a service. So it could be that a student has a deficit in reading, and they may be struggling in math, but that doesn't mean that automatically math should be added to their IEP and given additional services. So we really need to be looking at serving that student in the least restrictive environment. We hope that that's general education for most students, and the expectation is that that's where they are started and provided the supplemental aids and services necessary to keep them in general education, to be educated alongside their peers. And then if all of those strategies and supports and accommodations are not effective, that's when we start looking at different settings. But as Allison said, it is not just an automatic change or move of placement for their entire day or entire course. It may just be pieces of their day, depending on their deficit that was identified in the present levels. And I think kind of tying back to that goal progress monitoring, those need to be revisited annually. Just because they had a particular setting one year doesn't mean that that's not going to change. So that's why it's so important to collect ongoing data rather than just sticking with the report that was done from the initial evaluation or the most recent reevaluation. Use all of that data. I think also for LRE, an important part of that conversation that we also got some kind of related questions was about that collaboration between general education and special education. If a student is found to be a student with a disability, that does not mean that that student is just a special education student now. That student is a student first, and that general education teacher has just as much responsibility for that student's education as the special education teachers and related service providers. So it's finding a way to work together to really provide whatever supports and interventions are necessary collaboratively so that that student has access. So it's not about ownership of a student, it's not about ownership of goals or services, it's how are we all working together to find a successful path for this student.
Right. I think you hit on an important thing too, is that the services aren't tied to courses. We tend to think schedule, we tend to want the service page to look like a schedule for ourselves and the students, but it's not tied to courses. For example, we have lots of high schools that are on block schedules, so a class is only one semester long. They'll say that the student needs reading support in English language arts. English language arts is one semester. So what you're saying is that the student only has a reading deficit 3 months a year? I don't believe that's true, right? We need to be providing that reading across the day. So the service should be around the reading skill, and that can be provided wherever. There's a lot of reading skills required for social studies. It's a lot of nonfiction text, right? There's a lot needed in science, and frankly, math anymore is more text than numbers. So there's a lot of ways to integrate it, but it's really thinking about what the student needs and how we provide that. Did I miss anything?
No, that's great. Any other questions kind of related to least restrictive environment?
As pertains to LRE, if a student has been placed in EBS, the extended behavior support, and that student goes out to a residential facility and successfully completes it, when they return, should they be placed right back into the EBS, or should we reconsider that situation because there's the possibility of lapsing back in those previous behaviors?
I guess it depends too on who placed the student in the residential. There's different pathways to get to a residential program, as many of you guys know. If it was an IEP team decision, then absolutely you want to wean that child as best as possible back into that general education setting. But oftentimes what we're seeing across the state are parents and physicians are making decisions to send students to day treatment programs, residential facility programs outside of that IEP team decision. So please collaborate to the best of your ability. I would always recommend you guys sign a release of information between that residential day treatment program and the school. They may not be able to give you all the information based on how HIPAA has some obviously different regulations than FERPA does, but it'll allow you to know what was successful, what they were working on in that residential facility. And then I would always recommend a transition meeting to come back. And at that time, at that transition meeting, you can talk about LRE placement. Is that EBS program still appropriate? Or has this residential facility remediated a lot of the concerns that would allow the student to access more opportunities in their school day? Would I say blanket statement they should always re-enter at that exact LRE? No, I could never make that justification. But I think that transition meeting is the appropriate time to look at all the data, collect whatever has been collected during that residential stay, and then make that determination on a case-by-case basis for that student.
For sure, and I would just add that while an IEP must be completed annually, it can be held far more often, and especially in situations where students are returning to the school for a variety of reasons, right? Whether it be mental health or physical health or some other reason, I think it's important that we at least even schedule a check-in on where we are with the student, because that is a lot for everybody. But you can have those IEP meetings more often. So if you plan and say, oh, I think they're going to need to be in that, behavior program that's pretty intensive at first, but you see that they really are thriving, meet and acknowledge that and celebrate it and plan again. I know nobody wants to have extra meetings, but it is better to plan for success than to be stuck and held to an IEP that's no longer appropriate.
I think you spurred something in me too. We have seen such a huge uptick in our administrative complaints. Many of you guys know this, over 100% increase in our administrative complaints annually since COVID, which is really a lot. And a lot of those are based on those decisions that the IEP team is making, where we see over the years the students not making progress, right? We have those progress reports that show that they're at a 5, that Likert scale. They're going to meet the goal by the end of the IEP. Then that IEP comes and it ends. The new IEP goes into effect. You have the same justification in your progress reports, the student's going to meet goals. And then you have an advocate come and bring all of these IEPs where the goals have never changed, LRE has never changed, and the student's not making progress. I know many of you have probably heard me say this if you've ever attended my trainings, but it's the airport motto. If you see something, say something. And if you see that this child is not making progress, it's always in your best interest. Call a meeting and talk about what needs to happen. Maybe additional assessments need to happen. Maybe there's a new disability eligibility that needs to be considered that hasn't been. Maybe there's other factors, mental health factors, behavioral factors that are impeding that student's ability to make growth and progress. But do something about it. Where districts err is when they sit on it and they say, we'll talk about that once we get to the IEP meeting, and the IEP meeting may not be for 6 months. At that point, it's always in your best interest, as Allison said, go ahead and call a meeting just to document. Could we be doing anything different, and should we be?
And with that, one of the excuses for not making progress cannot be that the student is unmotivated, uninterested, or cannot. It really is an adult problem when students are not making progress, and so we need to continue to change and try. Will they make progress? Not necessarily, but we need to be trying new things and acknowledging that they're not making that progress rather than sitting on it or saying it's about the student.
Any other questions?
I'd like to focus some on the multilingual learners who are receiving special education services. And, you know, a continual dilemma that we have as educators is how to differentiate language acquisition issues with language learning issues and special needs in terms of language and reading in multilingual learners. Do we have any new information on that? Any new strategies for assessing and identifying multilingual learners with language needs or with disabilities?
That's a great point, Dr. Clark. And so one of the things that we still hold very close is database decision making. So understanding that when we're working especially with our English learners, that we need to be looking at a multitude of data sources. So we know that with our English learners, not only are we getting the assessment information, for example, that Allison and April have talked about, but we also have another component to consider, which is limited English proficiency. And so we need to make sure that when these decisions are being made for students, as far as what appropriate supports are, that we have our ESL specialists, our ESL coordinators, our teachers involved in that decision making, because that specialist, that expert, is going to help bring knowledge about what proper language development looks like. When we're talking about how English develops, the other team members will be able to bring their perspective on and what they see in the data about how a student is performing, and that's when those collaboration conversations happen when we're looking at this data. I know that April has done some work, actually a lot of work in this area. She actually has a community of practice, and I don't want to butcher the title, April, so.
I don't even remember what it's called, to be honest with you. It is recorded. It's on our professional development website. I think we'll be sharing our contact information, so feel free to shoot me an email if you would like to get that. It really is talking about, as you said, Dr. Clark, the differences between language difference and then a disability, and how do you flesh that out? And it takes a lot of assessment. It takes a lot of collaboration. But I think where we err is we make a lot of assumptions about students and language acquisition. I was actually consulting this morning with a district on a student who is newly to the United States, has some marked concerns behaviorally, also has some hearing issues, some PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, based on the move of where they came from. And the team is really quickly trying to move to an eligibility, as opposed to let's step back, let's collect a lot of data, let's do a really great ethnographic interview with the family. Let's really dig into their progress with language acquisition. Let's look at their siblings. It's so multifaceted, and every profile is going to be different. There's no uniform answer here. Just like when we say, when you meet one child with autism, you've met one child with autism, right? It's the same with our English language learners, and we can't make assumptions on their backs and say that they have a disability when in fact it could be a language difference. So feel free always, if you have a tricky case, to reach out to Joanne. Dr. Richardson is our Director of Intervention. Reach out to me. Can really talk through what assessments may be appropriate, talk through other pieces that you may want to consider as you're looking at our ESL students. Always happy to do that with you guys.
And I'm going to put in a plug for your speech-language pathologists. They are a really important team member when you're doing any assessments to really help discern, as April said, what is language acquisition versus what is potentially a language disability. And really, if the child has a language disability, it's going to exist in both languages. So it is not just going to be related to English. And so that's why it is so important to do the ethnographic interview, collect all of the data, talk to the families, which likely is going to require a translator. But I think one thing assessment specialists need to hear is don't try to make the current test that you have sitting on your shelf fit a student. If it's not appropriate, if it's not normed on them in that language, use other tools. It's really, the purpose is to evaluate that student and identify if there's a disability, not whether or not they scored a particular level on a test. And so that's going to require a lot of sources of data, a lot of conversations, a lot of observations. As April said, comparison to the development with peers. Talk to the family. You know, are they struggling even in their native language to communicate? So just really digging in and giving yourself permission that you might have to break away from the typical test that you would use to evaluate language or some other disability, and use sources that are out there that are more appropriate.
I do think it's important to remind you that this is all about spoken language. So for students whose primary language is ASL, there are a lot of language acquisition concerns around our students who are deaf or significantly hard of hearing, and that they are missing just that residual conversation that's occurring around them. But English language learning is around spoken language. So these are not students who should be assessed using like our state WIDA test or any other English language learner test, because it's about spoken, not about the fact that they have a visual or alternate language system.
And may I continue questioning related to that? In smaller districts, or even in some larger districts, staffing issues, including interim staffing, temporary staffing, lack of qualified staffing, may prevent us from calling on this group of different professionals in the district or in the school to support services. How do we address when schools have a shortage of staffing, of qualified staffing, speech and language pathologists, school psychologists, interventionists? How do you have suggestions for districts who are struggling with staffing and with lower resources?
I will say we have heard loudly of the staffing shortages across the state, and we hear you, and we certainly understand the predicament you're in. What we really would caution you against, we just had some recent, I think 2 administrative complaints around using unqualified, uncredentialed staff to work outside of their scope. Please be cautious of that. We would much prefer you call an IEP meeting and you have an honest, transparent conversation with parents saying, we do not have a paraprofessional, a paraeducator to work with your child based on the set forth IEP. This is our plan moving forward, how we will continue to support, and here is our consideration of compensatory services and what we're going to do in the future. We would much prefer you do that proactively rather than reactively, because typically those parents are then reaching out to us saying, well, they haven't followed the IEP as it's written. In terms of the related service providers, please reach out to myself. Jamie Seek is our speech and language pathologist coordinator at the state. We have a lot of initiatives right now around Grow Your Own for SLPs and school psychs. We also have a federal grant that is providing school psych interns to 40 of our rural districts. We have a lot of initiatives going on, and if you are not a part of those or you're not aware of what those are, please reach out to me as well. We would love to get you looped in so you know what's happening across the state to try to fill those vacancies. We certainly can help put the word out by getting you in touch with your local state agencies where you can post positions on your state sites, on your national sites. We certainly can help kind of navigate that for you, and then also give you other ideas of what you can do if you are missing one of those critical related service providers. Susan, Allison, any other?
It is not an easy time right now, for sure, in special education. We know that you all are all taxed and challenged with tremendous caseloads and not enough staff to meet their needs. I think one thing, and we do have some resources at the end of this, is know that compensatory services are not punitive. And in some cases, that's just something that needs to be provided to a student if there was not staff available to meet their services that are outlined in their IEP. And it is not a negative. It is not something that you all should see as being viewed upon, you didn't do your job. It just is truly a lack of staff. And it's a conversation, as April said, I think be upfront with parents. I mean, I think they know that the challenges that are occurring in schools around staffing, but be upfront, try to have a plan, include them in that conversation so that they don't find out 6 months down the road that this student has missed hours and, months of services. Did you have something you want to add?
I would say that they're kind of hitting on something that I just want to call out more directly, is that it is still, even in the light of the staffing shortages, which we're very aware of, it's not a quick fix, right? It's just going to take a while to get sufficient programs and sufficient people through. But even in this moment, it's still critical your IEP reflects what the student needs, not what you believe you have the capacity to provide. And if you don't have the capacity, have that conversation. But if you're tempering your IEPs by what you have, that is a problem. And so you really need to make sure that the IEP is reflective of the student needs, and then have that honest conversation with parents. Parents are great. Parents are kind when we're honest. When we're not honest, they have every reason to distrust us. And so just have that honest conversation with them. More often than not, you're able to brainstorm together. But if you're not honest from the front, it will be an uphill challenge, and it will be a challenge that you've kind of created for yourself. So make sure you have exactly what the student needs reflected accurately.
And I think too, just to echo that it doesn't negate your child find obligations. So if you don't have a school psychologist or an SLP, it doesn't mean that you can just say, we're not going to assess your child because we don't have anybody to assess your child. We are still bound under our child find obligations. If we suspect a disability, we move forward and we evaluate. And so you may need to reach out to your district leadership to figure out how to best do that. But you still are required to meet your child find obligations under state and federal law.
Great point. And those are really kind of connected. The last couple bullet points there really are connected because child find and capacity really do kind of go hand in hand. But certainly there's a lot of initiatives we're trying to take on, and we hear the challenges, absolutely. But as I hear Allison say this all the time, the IEP is not in a program and a plan for an adult, it's for the child. So we really have to continue to provide what is necessary for that student, individualize it, and make sure that we are doing everything we can to meet their needs, not the needs of the adults in the building.
Part of that is going back to your earlier question around, does it automatically become that they take intervention in high school, right? If we're not basing database decisions, if we're not systematically thinking about what students need, we do find that we've created these defaults that almost create a problem of capacity in and of themselves. So it's really important that the IEP truly is individualized to each student, because we might find that some of that capacity, and some schools have found that like they had a whole litany of high schoolers perhaps in like algebra AB who didn't even have a math deficit, they just had an IEP. So that reduced a lot of that capacity pool. So part of it is also just database decision-making for each and every child on their own individual needs.
Absolutely. And I would say too, for the related service providers too, making sure that your goals are connected to the content that they should be receiving in their classroom, not isolated skills, and it's not that they need to master the standardized assessment that's going to be administered upon the reeval. That's not the purpose of education. That's not the purpose of their IEP. It's not about their standardized test score. It's how are they accessing content and curriculum, so their goals need to be connected to content and curriculum. And so if we can kind of do some evaluation of your IEPs and look at students, what are the goals that are written? Are they appropriate for that child to be able to access ELA or math? Or am I working on skills that showed up on a test but really don't translate to functional skills within the classroom? And maybe reevaluating some of the goals, how services are written, are they individualized? Are they written for truly the skill deficits, or have we just made assumptions because the student is a student with a disability and we're putting them in more intensive restrictive classes?
We have a question up front.
Speaking on that, talk more about access to the standard without expectation for mastering the standard, and how that relates to LRE and decisions for students, especially as we bridge middle and high school, and the test that all the decisions are driven about. But it's not about the test, so please talk about that.
Well, let me ask you all a question first to kick off that discussion. What percentage or proportion, whichever you prefer, of standards must a student master in order to receive the regular diploma? I'm hearing some like 70, 80, 0. It's 0. Now, how do I know that? One, I was asked that question while presenting to the State Board of Education on live view across the entire state in front of my commissioner and had to answer, and she acknowledged that indeed I was correct. But two, I have a lot of degrees, and I know nothing about social studies and U.S. history. I know World War II's after World War I because I'm good at math, right? But I know nothing. We don't actually have to master standards to graduate. We have to demonstrate learning. So when we are saying that a student with an IEP must show mastery before they can participate or before they can engage in that classroom, we are actually holding them to a significantly higher standard than we are holding students without disabilities. Well, that's not equitable at all. So the reality is that mastery is a myth. It's about learning. And learning's hard to measure, and it's hard to know when learning's enough, right? I always say it's like nailing Jell-O to a tree. It's really messy, and you don't know what you're going to get when you're done. But that is what school is. And if we all reflect back to our engagement in school, we'll realize that, yes, we earned grades, but those grades were activities primarily designed by a teacher. They didn't necessarily show mastery of anything, but they showed that you were like listening and paying attention, and you started to think. Mastery is not the goal. The goal is learning. And hopefully we're all still doing that. I know I'm learning that I don't like I-24, but hopefully we're all still learning, right?
It's a good question.
What did I miss?
No, that's a great question. Great answer.
Well, I know we've got about 5 minutes. Did you want to add something, April?
Not about that. No, I was just going to say there was a couple other, just because I know that many of you guys know that the RTI manual has been redone and modified. Just reminding you guys that we have taken the position, if you have looked at the new RTI manual, you'll notice that all the mentions of data points and weeks and interventions and fidelity checks has been removed, and that just to caution you guys, we are not delaying, denying an evaluation for a specific learning disability based on a process. If anybody ever is talking or documenting, well, we can't evaluate Johnny because he's not in intervention. We can't evaluate because we don't have enough data points. We're doing it wrong. Okay, so make sure we are kind of pivoting with our language, and we're evaluating where we suspect a disability, not basing that on the process. Those two things can happen concurrently. I suspect Johnny has a specific learning disability. He can be enrolled in a tiered intervention, doesn't matter which one, right? And we can collect data as we evaluate. But the process should never be used to delay or deny an evaluation for a student. Just read a prior written notice this past week that said that. He could not be evaluated because he wasn't performing below the 25th percentile. We don't have 10th percentile, 25th percentiles. We have students who may need additional evaluation supports, and we evaluate students.
You triggered something in my head too, because it kind of ties into the capacity and Dr. Clark's question about, when you don't have the number of assessment specialists necessary. I know a lot of districts are relying on contracted outside providers to do your evaluations and your assessments and provide services as well. But remember, they are still held to the same Tennessee eligibility evaluation standards. And so what they may do in their medical or clinical setting often does not mirror what the expectation is in education, but that is what the expectation is. They cannot conduct assessments in a clinical model and then determine eligibility that way. They still have to follow our evaluation standards. So I just wanted to.
And as a reminder with that, they are a member of the team, not the team.
Exactly.
Just as a parent is a member, not the team. So even if you feel that there's a little disconnect, they are one member.
That's right. And the school is ultimately responsible. So I think we.
Going exactly where I was going to Let's plug resources
Okay,
before we
so
have
yes.
we have 50 seconds.
We're approaching the end of our session, so I just wanted to highlight a couple of the resources that we have available, some of them connected to what we spoke about today. The Tennessee Technical Assistance Network is a network that the state supports. We have multiple partners that are basically an extension of the department to help provide additional support, so you can access that there. We've got our special education framework, our TN Pulse manual and quick guides, and then other additional programming, resources. I know we talked about the compensatory education, some of the service delivery options, all of those are listed here. Some FAQs about amending IEPs. So just know that all of these can be found on our website, but if you can't find them, you can reach out to any of us. And here is our contact information.
Can I say
Yes.
one more thing? I know we're over time, sorry, Dr. Clark. We do hold monthly communities of practice across the buckets of work. So I know I hold them for assessment specialists, we hold them for instructionally appropriate IEPs. You guys hold them for characteristics of dyslexia, intervention, EL. Please, if you don't have those calendars, reach out to us. We would love to have you attend to get that information.
Thank you. And if you have a moment to take the survey, please do let us know how we're doing.
I can't thank you enough, because the fact that we have 4 or 5 people willing to come and sit with us for 45 minutes today and be available to talk and answer questions is a real gift. And so it makes me believe that our department is accessible to the practitioners of Tennessee. That is also a goal of the collaborative here.